it's worth it. Our next speaker is an author and software entrepreneur and has done several different things, but probably the most important thing, the reason why he's going to talk to us today is because he wrote a book called For Individual Rights. I think it's a very good book, and it sort of actually reminds me of Bastiat. If any of you have read Bastiat, it's very clear, like crystal. You see through it, and it just illuminates the whole thing, and you can just see it for what it is. And it does it without using complex, highly philosophical, jargony type language. You know, there's actually a part in the book that I really like that it says that, you know, a lie, the truth is simple, but the lie can be infinitely complex, right? So that's sort of, I think, the spirit of the talk that he'll be giving. And he's also currently, in addition to For Individual Rights, working on a book about reason, i.e. metaphysics and epistemology and how we know and how we can know and how can we make any assertions and this kind of foundational stuff. So, again, thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy Shayne Wissler.
First of all, I'd like to thank Students for Liberty and especially Dr. Gooch and the Koch Foundation, and especially Jonathan Hubbard. I wouldn't be here. This speech wouldn't really exist if it wasn't for Jonathan giving me some encouragement. This is just a general orientation here. I didn't know if everybody knew what natural rights were. So I'm just going to put that up a little bit. And you can read it. So this is going to be a talk about the roots of liberty. And we're going to talk about what liberty is, why it's good, and I'll be presenting a new theory of liberty in order to do this. Now, many people believe that there's no rational philosophic basis to libertarianism. They think libertarianism is subjective or arbitrary or personal preferences. It's not really true. Now, I think this is a really bad attitude. I think it's false. And you know, even more people, I think, believe that natural rights are arbitrary, that they're human constructs. They don't have any objectivity. Now, in this talk, I'm going to try to rejuvenate the concept of natural rights and try to show that if you change your perspective a little bit, you can actually make the idea fall perfectly into place. I'm also going to give a moral theory so that buttresses natural rights. So natural rights just say what's right and wrong. They don't say why it's right and wrong. So first, part one of this talk. Now, first of all, I think natural rights is science. And so like any science, we need to ground it in empirical, incontrovertible observations. So what are these observations of natural rights? Now, as Ayn Rand observed, life is a process of self-sustaining, self-generative action. So to live is to be doing something, and to not live, or if you stop doing stuff, you don't live. So the substance of your life, I think if you reflect just a little bit, the substance of your life is just action. So, and the word action telescopes from very broad to very specific sorts of actions. So you're sitting in your chair breathing and thinking, and but you can also build a house. So for example, or when you build a house, that's an action, building a house. And you can break up building a house into subordinate actions like going and gathering materials, nailing a plank of wood up. And so it's not just like human action just refers to specific things, it refers to broad things. But there's two kinds of distinction of action that I care about here. And the two kinds are interfering and non-interfering action. And I think libertarians would automatically know why I care about that. And I mean interference in a biological, objective sense. So, either a human action can interfere with another human action, it's not. So it's black and white. For example, if your cat eats a mouse, we don't say that the mouse may interfere with the cat. It's pretty obvious that the cat interferes with the mouse. Now, I named this distinction natural rights versus natural crimes. So I would say that every human action is either a right or it's a crime. So anything you're doing, if you're building a house, it's either a right or a crime. If you're breathing, it's either a right or a crime. Now I call this the first principle of rights, and that's where I kind of begin. When I start sorting human action into two types, that's the starting point. Now, some people, when they hear this idea, are kind of like surprised or they think maybe there's gray areas, maybe something's not a right or a crime. And that's good to start thinking about this. Now, in my theory, I would just say if you have a certain set of definitions and it turns out that you think this definition, it turns into something fuzzy, then I'm saying clarify your definition and make it such that the principle holds. So in other words, question the definitions, not the principle. That's my theory. Now, note that a major objection to natural rights is that they're not real. So they're like fictional things. And what I'm saying is that human rights are just actions, and actions are real, and so therefore, natural rights exist. Okay. So this is Thomas Jefferson talking about rightful liberty as unconstrained or unobstructed action. And this is pretty much the same concept, really. So note here that since substance of your life is actions, therefore your rights are really nothing more nor less than your rights. So if you're a peaceful person, everything you're doing when you're living your life is just an exercise of your rights. So now liberty is just basically a state where your rights are not infringed by crimes. So every human action is a right or crime, and so you have liberty if nobody's interfering with you. And basically libertarianism is the idea, a libertarian is basically a crime fighter in essence, where he doesn't just fight crimes that individuals commit, he cares that government commits them too. Now, some people claim that interference is relative. So they'll say, if you're fired from your job, that interfered with you because you wanted to keep your job. Now, I call this an equivocation because it's really talking about two different kinds of interference. There's interfering actions, but then this interfered with your wishes. So I'm not talking about wishes, I'm talking about actions. But in general, we need a method to determine, whether a given action infringed or not. And Kinsella is the lawyer, so he could tell me how to pronounce prima facie. I'm not sure if that's correct, but that's what.
Good enough.
Is that good enough? So basically, if we want to talk about whether somebody getting fired is an infringement, the burden of proof goes with somebody who's going against the prima facie case or the case as it first appears. So to anybody with common sense, being fired from your job, nobody hit the person, nobody kicked them or stole his stuff. They just said, "Don't come on my property anymore." So if the guy who wants to claim that getting fired was an interference, he has the burden of proof. And we'll listen to him. We should listen. He should go present a case, maybe get a contract. So now let's get into an analysis of natural rights. So I just said basically what they are. So why do we need an analysis? Isn't it obvious whether something's interference or not? And I think it's obviously not obvious because libertarians argue about this all the time. So, they argue about abortion or locking a proviso or patents or what counts as land ownership or what does it mean to abandon something. And the point is, since every human action is either a right or a crime, okay, And then if you're confused about this, what does that mean? It means you might be advocating crime. So you need to be very clear about what the difference is. Now, another important point is if you're in a court of law, imagine that the judge just shoots from the hip and he doesn't think it's very objective. Okay. Do you want to be in that court of law, or would you rather be in a court of law where the judge believes it's scientific and either you did or didn't do it? So human action has a vast range, and so it's kind of like biology. So if you look at biology, you have a taxonomy of creatures, and you have all different types of creatures. And the biologists break it up into different types in order to understand it, and I think we need to do this for rights as well. So we need a rights taxonomy. Now, John Locke came up with a particular taxonomy, and he said that our rights break down into life, liberty, and property. Now, I would not separate life from liberty, and the reason why is because if you fully interfere with somebody's liberty, they're dead. So to fully interfere is to stop all their actions, which is to kill them. So I wouldn't separate the two. Also, if you interfere at all with anybody, you essentially change who the person is. For example, if you imprison them for 20 years and they can't pursue a career in medicine, the person who comes out of prison is not the same person that would have been if he had his liberty. So you're really destroying his life as it should have been, or as it would have been. So I wouldn't separate those two. Now, regarding property, I think it's too narrow of a concept. I think there's more rights than that, and you can decide whether you agree with me or not, but after I give you my categories. So I break it down to more than just property. So the method of categorization here is important, and I think categories should be fundamental and comprehensive of all rightful action, and distinguishes things that are different. So, and the thing about my theory is because I say all rights are all human action, I mean all rights are human action, then the point is to keep a focus on what does action have to do with this right. So if we're talking about property rights, for example, we're not thinking in terms of my name tagged on it. We're thinking in terms of what are people doing in reality that's infringing a property right. So the rights as I give them are rights to self, property, medium, land, consent, and justice. I'll go to these each in turn. Now, right to self is the right to exercise your natural abilities without interference, to reside in a given place, or to move from place to place, even if it's unoccupied. And freedom of speech, I would say, is derivative of right of self, because freedom of speech is just an exercise of your natural abilities. And so, if anybody stops you, unless you do something wrong and they interfere with you, they're violating your right of self. And one thing that a lot of people don't quite realize is what I call the principle of the hidden gun. And I think Stefan Lawley has a different principle that's similar. And basically, the idea is if somebody's sitting in front of you, pointing a gun at you, then that's interfering with your right of self. But if he moves to the next room and tells you with a credible threat that he's going to come point a gun at you, then that's violating your right of self. And if he goes to the next town and calls you and says he's going to come over your house and point a gun at you, if you don't do what he says, that's infringing it. And it doesn't matter if he goes all the way to Washington, D.C. and passes laws and says if you don't do what the law says, he's going to point a gun at you. They're all the same thing. So, and what I kind of don't understand about this is that basically, well, first of all, the point is that physical hiding of the gun, which is only brought out when you don't obey, is kind of a trick that an oppressor uses to make it appear like everything's peaceful, but it's not peaceful. And this is kind of like a loss of object permanence in adults. Children usually see, that if something when they learn that when something goes away, that it'll come back. And adults seem to have lost this when it comes to guns and government wheels. Imagine a country full of slaves where all the slaves are obeying and doing what they're ordered, but they don't rebel, and so somebody calls that peaceful. I mean, only somebody who doesn't have object permanence would say that. So, next right after soft is property. Now, in my theory, I don't define property in a really broad way. I'm talking pretty specific. So I'm talking about like a backpack or a house or something, some physical object. So, and that's just how I define it. Now, the point about property is that the foundation is action. So, what are the actions with regard to property? Now, the actions, I have 5 actions. So, there's pursuit, claim, acquisition, ownership, and abandonment. And imagine a wild apple tree. And you see a wild apple tree on the hill and say, I want one of those juicy apples. So you start pursuing those apples. So you're going up the hill. And maybe somebody else is pursuing it up the other side. So maybe he likes the idea of apples too. Now, once you get to the apple you like, you reach your hand up. And you haven't touched the apple, but you claim the apple, which means everybody can see that you want that apple. And at that point, if somebody tried to snatch it away from you, they violated your right there. Now, acquisition is you actually touch the apple, you grab it. And then ownership is now you're eating it and you're enjoying it. And then now you throw it over your shoulder and you abandon it. And all property goes through these phases. Now, the thing to remember about this, like I said originally, action is an abstract concept. So if we talk, building a home is an action. Living in a home is an action. And so, we can't, somebody says, oh, you left the house, you're not using it anymore. That's ridiculous. They're just being concrete and overly narrow about the definition of action. So, regarding abandonment, that can be very complex. I'm not going to get into that. People can argue about whether something is abandoned or not. Now, crimes against property, use without permission, theft, vandalism, obvious crimes. But there's a special crime, and Kinsella mentioned this too, patents. So the thing with patents, the way I would look at it, there's a guy that comes up with an idea, goes out, creates some product, starts selling it on the market, making money, and all of a sudden he gets a knock on the door, and he's got a summons because he has to go to court because somebody claims that he thought of it first, and he's got it, registered with a bureaucrat or whatever. And the point, let's go back to the prima facie case. So, what is the appearance here? So the appearance is, if you're not indoctrinated with the idea of patents, you're not going to say that the guy that was creating on his own violated, interfered with anybody. You're going to say, well, the guy threatening him, to take his property away is the one that interfered. So if you deprogram your assumptions about patents, you'll see that, the prima facie case is that the patent holder is the rights violated. Okay, so on its face, the default goes to the guy that didn't have the patent, was just creating stuff. That's the default. And the burden of proof goes on the patent holder, not to prove, patents are legitimate, or not to prove that, it is to prove that they're legitimate. It's not just to prove that he violated the patent. It's to say they're legitimate, and nobody's done that. So anybody who's confused about patents, okay, you have to default side against patents to start with. Okay? Until somebody proves absolutely to you that it's infringement. Now, another special crime, I call it frivolous pursuit. And think back to the apple. So you go to reach for an apple, and then somebody, playing games with you, so they snatch it out from under you. Okay? So I call it frivolous pursuit. I would also call it frivolous pursuit if a businessman is selling apples, and he knows that some locals are going up to these wild apple trees and collecting these apples. And then the businessman sneaks in, destroys all the apple trees so he can raise the prices. Okay? The businessman isn't trying to pursue profitable activity except by destroying things. So, And this is related to locking proviso, but I'm not going to get into that. It's kind of different. Now, medium rights. The next right's medium. And they pertain to established patterns of use in acquiring property from nature. So, for example, you have a cabin and you go down to the river each day and you get a bucket of water. And you've been doing that for a while, so it's established. And then somebody up the river decides, oh, the river's going through my land, it's my river, and he diverts it. Okay? So he interfered with your medium rights. Another example of medium rights, airplane flying through the air. In essence, it's going through different phases of property acquisition, claiming, and abandonment as it flies through the air, regarding the medium of the air. Or a farmer is using sunlight, which I would call it as a medium, and if somebody blocks it, sunlight in a spaceship, then I would say that's an interference with medium rights. Now, medium rights can be very complex. So imagine you have a city upstream, city downstream, and they're both growing kind of naturally. And the upstream city just decides, we're going to divert the whole river. That's a violation of downstream cities' rights. But what if they grow in such a fashion that all of a sudden the downstream city starts having problems and they start running out of water? How do you sort that out? I don't know the answer to that. So that one seems complex to me. Although maybe we can solve those better answers. But let's see. So land. Now we typically think of land as like a two-dimensional parcel, but really land is like the medium of the earth. And nobody owns like a pyramid of land going down to the core of the earth. What they own is their medium right to the land and to the objects on the land. So really we've covered land already. So we've covered property, we've covered medium, so we've covered everything we do with land. But let's see. So this is just a relevant quote, because the special thing about land is governance. And so I break government into two fundamental types, depending on the rules governing their jurisdictions. So, and I would say there's a natural law rule, and then there's man-made law rule. And I understand the difference. Imagine your home. You can make the rules for your home, right? So it's a kind of government of your own home. You own the property, you set the rules. Whereas, imagine somebody is being raped on some other person's property. Would you say you have a right to trespass and protect the person? And so in that case, your right is to be able to help the person. And so there's no jurisdiction on that. So natural law, I would say, has no boundaries of jurisdictions. And whereas man-made law is only on your own property. And I think this distinction is one of the most important legal distinctions you can possibly make. Is whether it's a natural law or whether it's a man-made law. So I like these two quotes. So the answer to the first question, there's two alternatives. If you're on somebody else's land, then you're subject to their rules. If you don't like the rules, you leave, right? So they have that kind of power over you. And the other answer is if you're a criminal and you violate somebody's rights, then you've given anyone power over you. Okay? The whole human race can come help you. So the problem here is modern governments pretty much act like they own the whole planet. They've lost the distinction or any conception of the distinction between natural law and man-made law. And I think I missed making this clear. When I say natural law, I mean natural rights. I hope that's clear. Natural law is basically the governance of upholding natural rights. And I think that is what's wrong with governments, is that they have no idea, the populace has no idea either, that there's this distinction. And these governments not only act like they own the whole planet, they actually think they own the whole universe. And I'm not exaggerating one little bit. If you look at the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, they declared that if you build a spaceship and go anywhere in the universe, okay, the laws follow you there. Okay? So these are, I would say that they're literally insane megalomaniacs. So, now, next question is genesis of governments. Now, I think I'm the first non-anarchist to talk today, but now I agree with the anarchist principles. That means I agree with the ethical principles. I agree with 100% consent. So then I have to, burden is on me to say, well, how does government come about? Okay. So I'm, first of all, like I said, if you own your home, you can make the rules on your home. If you and your neighbor, so you have a list of rules for yourself. And some of those rules probably implicitly are don't kill, right? Don't kill in my home. So you can get together with your neighbor and you say, what are some laws that are in common between my house and your house? And your houses are right next to each other. Okay? So you can come together and say, well, the ones in common, we might as well just implement them in common. Why repeat the same thing on each household? And then you get a bunch of neighbors. You can make an HOA, homeowners association, or you can even grow it to a city-state, as long as everybody's all well connected to each other. Okay? And you can have common laws that apply to your city. Now the other kind of government, the one that makes anarchists really mad, for good reason, but is what I would call the natural law or federal jurisdiction. And the federal, I mean, when I talk federal, I'm not talking nation state like we have now. I'm just talking, I can go defend a woman being raped whenever, wherever. Or I can defend routes of travel if I want to. And so since I can do it myself, then I can contract with any folks I want to get together and defend the natural law anywhere I want. Now, I can't stop people from doing the same thing, so I can't stop. I can't give you an argument that stops competition on that level. But I kind of think that people would tend, as long as the government's good and it's going in a healthy way, as long as it's handled correctly, I think it could be that you have, basically one, so long as it doesn't stop others. I'm just saying I don't think the others would care very much. Now, crimes against this right is trespassing, taxation without consent, man-made legislation without consent, blockades, assertion of ownership, going beyond actual use. Now, this is what I'm talking about with the megalomaniacs. They step on a continent, and then they essentially claim they own the whole United States, and they start fabricating man-made laws across the whole thing. Okay? That's a crime. On the flip side, if you plop down a home and there's established egress going through your land, then you can't interfere with that because it's established medium rights, right of travel. Okay, so the next right is consent. Now, consent is a mental action, so it's a human action, of reassigning rights with a corresponding physical action that conveys this mental action to others. It's the heart of the term voluntary. So, in an important sense, it's a fountainhead of all rights. Okay? And the right of consent is basically a recognition of the individual reason in determining what counts as interference. If somebody slices you with a knife, it's not assault if the person is your surgeon. You agreed to the surgery. Consent, I would say, is the crown of all the rights. It explicitly recognizes that your rights, the root of your rights is your reasoning mind. That's the root. It recognizes you're the king, lord, or master that governs all your rights. And you get to decide whether you appropriate from nature, or trade with other people, or form associations. So an attack on any right, any of these other rights, is a violation of consent. consent in effect. Now, special crime against this is fraud. And fraud produces a counterfeit consent through deception. So, suppose a dentist tells you your tooth has a cavity, you don't really have a cavity, but he fills your tooth anyway and charges you. Okay? He's basically violently assaulted you and stolen your money. Okay, so fraud is violence in that case. You just didn't happen to know it, but it was violent. Okay. This is another favorite quote of mine. So the next right is justice. So justice is a human action, and it's a right to halt ongoing interference with your rights. So you have a right to stop somebody from interfering with you. Self-defense is the first Genesis example of this. So if somebody's pointing a gun at you, you have a right to take whatever actions to stop that, and that's justice. If somebody owes you something and they're not paying it back, okay, they are stopping you from enjoying the right of your property. So you have a right to go get your property back, maybe through legal means, or maybe if you live in a complete anarchist city-state, you can do it a different way. But you have a right to do it. Now, justice is not interference. You may be going and somebody was sitting there using your property and being happy with their iPad they stole. And so he could say, well, you're interfering, you initiated force. But no, he's the one that's initiated because he's the one that's robbed your right to your property. Now, justice has a lot of complexities. I'm not going to get into this, but I will say that no philosophy, which is all I'm talking about, can substitute for basically what lawyers do, what judges do, what honest people do when they like adjudicate cases. You can't adjudicate every case in philosophy. So what I've done is show that natural right can be viewed as a type of action. And the view this way, it's a change of perspective, but viewed this way, natural rights exist, they're objective, they're biological scientific facts. And this whole bit has been simplified from my book. So part two. Part two is going to be the rational and moral basis of natural rights. So I haven't given, all I've said is I define a right as human action that doesn't interfere. I haven't said you shouldn't violate it. Obviously, I think you shouldn't, but I haven't given an argument for that. So why does it matter to justify rights? First of all, knowing clearly why they should be respected is a good thing, and I think it's kind of self-evident. But I think if there's unanswered corrupt philosophy, you can create a doubt and a lack of moral courage and action in reality. A confused, morally uncertain person is passive, apathetic, and compliant, and tends to put up a lot of abuse. So I think it's good to know why it's wrong. It can cause a moral outrage. Okay. Now, related arguments are Ayn Rand's meta-ethics, Stefan Molyneux's UPB, which is actually a broader type of answer than mine, and Hans Hermann Hoppes' argumentation ethics. When I say it's broader, I'm just saying I don't care about ethics in general. I'm just trying to justify natural rights. And all of these are related to what's called the Izzat problem in philosophy, and you have similarities and differences. Everything in this whole category has similarities and differences. And really, it's a large philosophical topic. If you want to really get to the root of all this, you have to talk about metaphysics, you got to talk about epistemology, you got to talk about meta-ethics is a big area. So I'm just going to try to get it across just briefly. Now, you can't fully talk about grounding liberty and reason without saying what is reason. So I can't, so I'm just going to give a little simple overview. First, reason is to inductively draw propositions or ideas from evidence empirically. So number two is to refrain from contradiction. Number three, examine issues from a variety of perspectives. Now, different theories count as a perspective, so you might want to look at different theories. And it's not purely deduction. So a reason that's only concerned with internal consistency or deduction, in my view, that's not reason. It's really a counterfeit of reason that employs the machinery of reason in an abusive way, but it misses the whole point. The point of reason is truth. To get to truth, we look at reality. And to sort of cleave reason from its inductive base is to just destroy it. Okay? So we have to be factual. Now, again, my definition of rights here is descriptive. It's not normative. So the key proposition here, the key proposition is that you shouldn't violate rights. The statist, in theory, could agree with my definition of rights. He could say, yeah, that's interference, but too bad the government said that I can do it, or whatever. Now, there's two steps in my argument. One is that you ought to follow reason. That's my first premise. My next premise is that reason necessarily endorses natural rights. Okay, so one ought to follow reason. I like the last reason the best. So, still reading that? So, in simple terms, we're having a discussion here, and discussion will follow reason. If you don't follow reason, we're not having a discussion. Irrationality is just kicked out. It's kind of a nonsense race, or any nonsense, you just send it out. And all the other rational oughts that we can talk about.
Should be a mute key somewhere there.
I think it's Walter Block anyway.
Okay, all the other oughts that we can talk about, they're either going to derive from follow reason, or they're not. If they don't derive from follow reason, okay, then they're not reason, and then we don't need to worry about them. If they follow from reason, then we crossed what the is-ought gap. Now, I've actually thought of counter arguments to the idea you should follow reason. I want to say, what might somebody say? And I think these are all interesting and fun little games we can play, and I cut them out because I didn't want to be silly when we talk. Because I think it is silly. Whoops. Well, dang it, I'm missing a slide. I'm going to quote Galileo here. So, this is Galileo. And who can doubt that it will lead to the worst disorders when minds created free by God are compelled to submit slavishly to an outside will? So why does reason endorse natural rights? So to give a summary, I'll say because you've been given freedom of thought, you must endorse the freedom of action. Okay, so why is that? What is freedom of thought? So freedom of thought is following evidence where it leads you instead of being bound by dictates of emotions, traditions, or authority. It's a freedom of looking at things from all perspectives instead of being constrained by limited perspectives. Someone who believes something just because they feel like believing it is not free in their thought. Okay? The emotions aren't freely chosen. We don't freely choose our emotions. If we did, we could just be happy all the time. So they bubble up based on the circumstances and based on prior assumptions. So it's not a valid source of truth. So somebody who believes something just because they want to is a prisoner of their own past, basically, or their circumstance. A rational mind, on the other hand, freely follows evidence where it leads. It's not bound by outside influences or internal biases. A rational mind refuses to subordinate itself to any person, whether directly through obedience or indirectly through vague emotions. It will only follow facts where they lead. A rational mind recognizes that one must be free to conclude for oneself. It claims total prerogative of authority for itself. A rational mind accepts no arbitrary limits or constraints, but only constraints that are dictated by logic and reality. Now, this is a radical anti-authoritarianism of mind. claiming the total prerogative to think and conclude for oneself. But this means that one is free to conclude about what one ought to be free to do. One cannot rationally conclude both that one should be free to do something and that one ought to be blocked from doing something, the same thing. Therefore, a radical anti-authoritarianism of mind inexorably endorses radical anti-authoritarianism of action. Therefore, a truly rational person believes that reason should be given the widest possible berth, and that it should be restricted by nothing but the refusal to be absurd and illogical. And as a natural consequence of this, human action must also be given the widest possible berth, since human action flows from human conclusions about how to act. So what is the widest possible berth? So it's precisely the limit drawn by natural rights. Natural rights specify that you should be free to take any action whatsoever, so long as the action does not, by interfering with others, undercut the original premise that one should be free from interference. Your rights end where another person's begin, and this is the law of equal liberty. So one who rejects natural rights can't be rational, because to reject natural rights is to advocate arbitrary constraining of his own reason. The foregoing demonstrates the intimate relation of reason and natural rights. The liberty of our minds logically entails endorsing the liberty of our actions. Now, irrationality is nothing if it's not created, and it can create an endless supply of objections to the idea that we should be free to think and act in our thinking. And it's entertaining to point out all the flaws in all these objections. But I only want to address one category right now. And the reason I'm addressing it is because it's at the very foundation of all philosophy. And to make an objection like this is to undercut any science of truth of anything. And how much time do I have?
About 15 minutes.
So this is Isaac Newton's fourth rule of reasoning. So I'm going to restate this. I'm going to say that to follow reason is to follow the evidence. We don't follow idle speculations and fantasies. To arrive at a belief, it's sufficient to point out that all the known evidence leads to a certain conclusion and no evidence leads to a contrary conclusion. Following reason isn't any more demanding than that. So to make additional demands beyond this definition is unreasonable. In the history of the debates about natural rights, the placement of burden of proof has been perverse. Concerning the proper limits of human action, a rational person is not going to conclude that he shouldn't be free to do something unless he can prove he should. He's going to conclude the opposite. Absolutely everything should be permitted without which can be conclusively proven to be logically disallowed. So all evidence points to liberty. There's no evidence for any contrary conclusion, and the burden of proof lies squarely on the enemies of liberty. So in conclusion, I've offered a new theory of natural rights which shows that they're real and objective as the beating of your heart. I've offered a new moral justification of natural rights that roots are supported them solidly in reason. The roots of liberty consist of a proper conception of both reason and natural rights. And as I pointed out earlier, to cleave induction from reason is to destroy a proper concept of reason and create a counterfeit. Likewise, to cleave reason from liberty is to destroy the concept of liberty and create a counterfeit liberty. If you want true liberty, you need to recognize that liberty is rooted in reason, and the reason is rooted in facts. Now, as a final thought to leave you with today, I think if you look at history, you'll find that libertarianism emerged from the Enlightenment, and this was otherwise known as the Age of Reason. And this was a time when freedom of thought flourished, and so it's no coincidence that the idea of freedom of action began at that point. Now, historically, libertarianism arises because of the rising respect for reason in all spheres. coming down to us through libertarian political philosopher John Locke, who is himself inspired by the work of his friend Isaac Newton and by other rational thinkers. It was this spirit of the Enlightenment that brought about the greatest age of prosperity the world has ever known, and it's the loss of the spirit. It's destroying the momentum of our progress. It may even lead to our downfall. We need to reclaim the spirit of the Enlightenment. We want to lead the way forward to an even greater age of prosperity. Thanks for listening.